Coolidge had the nickname Silent Cal. And the most famous, he's stories of all kinds of famous stories. One of them was the one that I think it was Dorothy Parker said. When he died, she was told Calvin Coolidge was dead. She said, "How can they tell?" Then there was the one that said Calvin Coolidge looked like he was weaned on a dill pickle. And there is a true, supposedly true story that he was at a dinner party one night and a lady next to him said, "Oh, Mr. Coolidge, I've heard so much about you. I have a bet with my husband and that I can get you to say more than 3 words." And he said, "You lose." Coolidge was also the most, shall we say, somnolent president in American history. He slept 10 hours a night and napped during the daytime. He slept his term away. During Coolidge's term, the stock market reached dizzying heights. Everybody was playing the market. Prohibition was the name of the day, the name of the law, but rum running was the name of the country. And the Prohibition spawned a new force in American life: organized crime, bootlegging, alcohol cooking, distribution, strong arm distribution by force of beer, liquor. The head of all the criminal syndicates, the one who's best known, of course, is Al Capone, who took over Chicago around 1924. But he wasn't by any means the only one. The Dutch Schultz in New York, and there were many of the gangsters around the country. They served a real purpose. They came to power because people wanted alcohol, and they were the ones who would supply it. Prohibition is a classic example of the fact that passing laws does not control people's behavior. It simply makes them criminals when they go out and do what they want to do anyway. And if there are enough of them to violate the law and make the law ridiculous, and make the law meaningless, the law will no longer be effective. Prohibition was an issue, however, in the 1928 election when the so-called wets, the immigrants, the Catholics, the big city people, lined up behind Al Smith, the Democratic candidate, and the so-called dries lined up behind Coolidge. But in 1928 already, Prohibition was contributing to a realignment in the political system. Since the Civil War, with the exception of Woodrow Wilson, and I mentioned Cleveland earlier, the Republican Party had completely dominated the White House, and again in the 1920s. But some of those new immigrant votes were driven out of the Republican Party, largely by Prohibition and by the movement of a new movement in the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was no longer restricted to the South and to Irish immigrants who had opposed the Civil War. Now, with the influx of immigrant votes and with the growth of a labor vote against the big Republican business interests, the Democratic Party was beginning to find a new personality. And in 1932, it came together with the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Preceding that came the great stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression. The Depression was no surprise to people who had been paying attention to the American economy. First of all, the American economy was linked to the European economy. And after those few years of hysteria in the early years of the 20s when everything was booming, it became obvious that there was a depression in Europe. England experienced the Great General Strike, I believe, in 1925, if I'm not mistaken. In Germany, inflation was such a runaway pace that people would send home in the morning to spend their money before it became worthless by night. The German war debt was crippling, and the German reparations were too big for Germany to pay. Germany had to borrow the money to pay the reparations. It borrowed it largely from American bankers, and when the money could not be repaid, it threw the American banking system into chaos. Not only that, but as Europe rebuilt after the war, the desolation of Europe rebuilt, there was less of a market for American products in Europe, particularly American farm products. And an agricultural depression began in the United States around 1925. Freight car loadings, which is a very significant figure, began to drop in the late 20s. So the signs of an unhealthy economy were there. Also, there was a pyramiding of holding companies, similar to our own high finance in the 1980s, which greatly increased corporate debt. All right, corporate debt is not a problem as long as the sales hold up. But when the sales go down and the debt is higher, it squeezes corporations and drives them into bankruptcy. And that was what the climate that was happening under Coolidge in the 1920s, except nobody noticed it, or at least a lot of people didn't notice it. Also, there was no safety net in the 1920s. There was no Social Security. There were no guaranteed government deposits. There was nothing to prevent the economy from taking exaggerated swings, such as we now have. One thing had been put in place, the Federal Reserve System, which went into effect during the Wilson administration. Federal Reserve is essentially a bank for bankers. It is not a federal government corporation, but nor is it a private corporation. It is a mix. The President of the United States appoints some of the directors, including the head of the Federal Reserve. Private banks own it, but the profits that the Federal Reserve makes on its operations go into the U.S. Treasury. So it's a hybrid. It serves as a central national banking system where other banks can draw to prevent runs on their banks, to expand credit. The Federal Reserve has a method of control in the country, and all this provides us with something like a central banking system that we hadn't had since Andrew Jackson in 1830 slew the Bank of the United States. But outside of that, the federal economy was not, the national economy rather, was not much controlled by government at all. And it was subject to excessive swings up and down. And in 1929, the stock market crash did not cause the Depression, but caused a loss of confidence and wiped out a lot of individuals. It caused a loss of confidence in the economy, which in turn led to the Great Depression. And in 1932, the large number of unemployed and underemployed people led to a political revolution, the election of Franklin Roosevelt. It's a landmark in American history, equal to the election of Lincoln in 1960. Those are the two great occasions when you had a major reversal of political affiliation in the country. From 1860 till 1932, the Republican Party was easily the dominant party outside the South. From 1932 to the present, the Democratic Party is the dominant party, at least in congressional and local elections, and often in presidential elections. And that resulted from the Depression reversal, which took so many people from the Republican Party into the Democratic Party, working people primarily. Roosevelt's coalition was made up of union labor and and other laborers who were not unionized, small business people, large numbers of immigrant votes in the big cities, wets who opposed prohibition, and the traditional Southern South, dry Southern South. So it was a coalition of elements that had nothing in common with each other. Also into this coalition were thrown a large number of black voters, outside the South primarily because blacks in the South were still not permitted to vote. And so many of the immigrants in the big cities who regarded Roosevelt as nothing less than a savior. Roosevelt came into office at the worst time of the Depression, March of 1933. Immediately proclaimed a 5-day bank holiday to keep the banking system from falling apart, and passed through Congress a series of bills unprecedented in American history, which put the federal government in the business of providing jobs for Americans, support for American individuals, a revolution in American politics. Many of these bills were declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Others did not actually go into effect. But the fact that Roosevelt appeared to be doing something had a great psychological effect. The trouble with Hoover, the previous president, was that he didn't feel he could do anything about the Depression. He felt the only thing to do was to ride it out. In fact, it was Hoover who was responsible for the word depression in an interesting way. Hoover said, we aren't experiencing a business recession, a going back of business, just a minor depression, a little downward trend. Well, today those terms have taken a reverse meaning. A recession is a minor downward correction, and a depression is what we're all afraid of. But in Hoover's time, he used the words in a completely the opposite way. A depression was supposed to be not a major thing at all. Well, the Great Depression lasted really from 1932 at least till 1937 and probably to really 1940. And whatever Roosevelt did to try to get out of the Depression may have had some effect, but the real recovery didn't occur until the military buildup before World War II really began in earnest. What Roosevelt's administration did was to put government, in the tradition of Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt, squarely on the side of the individual as against economic interests. Roosevelt made people feel that the federal government cared about them as individuals. Of all the programs of the Roosevelt administration, the one that has probably had the most impact was Social Security, which was passed in 1935, and today is the most sacred of all the sacred cows, the biggest of all the entitlement programs, and I think, except for the defense budget, the largest single thing in the federal budget, Social Security, which provides that working people put money aside in the form of taxation and receive benefits on retirement. And also, Social Security benefits have been established for the disabled, for young whose parents die, or a number of other people. But primarily, Social Security was intended as a hedge against future recessions, because it would guarantee that older people had some purchasing power. The theory of the Roosevelt administration and his gang of college professors who advised him was that the trouble with the recession was that people couldn't buy all the goods that could be produced. The Roosevelt administration was the first to attack the problem of underconsumption. And the Roosevelt answer was to supply people with purchasing power, to guarantee that the enormous, vast number of people out there in the country had money to spend to keep the wheels of industry going. When you think of it, Roosevelt just went one step further than Henry Ford. In 1914, Henry Ford adopted a $5 a day wage for workers in his plant in Dearborn, Michigan. And industrialists told him he was crazy. The prevailing wage at this time was $3 a day. Ford was almost doubling wages. Henry Ford's answer was, if I pay my workers more, they can buy Fords. And that will be good for business. The lesson of the Roosevelt administration, the lesson of Henry Ford's thinking is, poverty is bad for business. And if you think of it that way, Franklin Roosevelt was the ultimate capitalist. At a time when Russia became economically socialist and many European countries were debating with the question of socialism, when Germany became fascist, the American answer was to supply more purchasing power to individuals to keep the wheels of the economy going. The Roosevelt administration, I think, was the first to deal with the question of underconsumption, and it remains the question in the American economy today. There's no question of the productive power of the American economy, in fact, of the world economy. We can produce more goods and services than we can possibly consume. The question is, how do we get those goods and services to be used to keep the wheels going? And our modern answers are three things: governmental entitlement programs, such as the Roosevelt Social Security program, massive advertising and promotion of goods, and third, what was the third one I just thought of? Can't think of it. I'll think of it in a minute. But massive advertising and promotion of goods is the second one that keeps the wheels going. And what's the third one? Geez, I had it at the tip of my tongue. I'll have to. At the moment, there are two of them. Well, two big things at the moment that keep purchasing power up. So the distribution of goods, the sale of goods, is the key to the functioning of the American economy. It's the reason why the American economy has been so successful since 1932, because we have managed to produce more and more and to consume more and more of what we produce. Roosevelt administration was the first to deal with the problem of consumption, of the enormous productive capacity of the United States. One of the ways it did so was through entitlement programs, basically the Social Security program and others, which put purchasing power in the hands of individuals. The second way has been through private industry's massive advertising and promotion campaigns. Advertising has become the key 20th century business in the sense that moving goods has become more important than creating goods and services. And thirdly, the Roosevelt administration contributed something else to modern American economics: the concept of massive public spending, government spending. It was under the Roosevelt administration that the Reconstruction Finance Company, which actually began under Hoover, began making very big loans to private enterprise to provide jobs during the Depression. The Roosevelt administration engaged in a massive program of building post offices and public works during the Depression. To this day, you go to most American cities, you'll see the post offices built between 1932 and 1940, frequently. A huge, massive building program. Dams were built. The Army Corps of Engineers built large numbers of public works water projects. The Civilian Conservation Corps was founded. All kinds of projects were developed and to allow for spending of money to put more money into the economy, so-called pump priming, as John Maynard Keynes called it. It's been a major factor of American life ever since. The biggest difference between the American economy of the 19th century and the American economy of the 20th is the enormous growth of the public sector spending and public sector employment since 1932. This was unheard of before, and it was the major legacy of the 20th century and Franklin Roosevelt's administration. It also has taken place on the state level to an even greater degree. People don't realize it, but federal government expenditures are not the only expenditures by government, and in fact, they're not even most. States and municipalities spend far more than the federal government does overall. One more reflection of this, and the thing that really drove the United States out of the Depression, was the preparedness for war in World War II. For the first time, military spending in peacetime became an important part of the economy. And it has remained so ever since. World War II, of course, was wartime, but since World War II, peacetime defense spending has been a major factor in the American economy, particularly in places like California, where so many of the defense production industries are located. At any rate, the Roosevelt administration amounted to a revolution in the way government acted in the economy. The government had always been, since Theodore Roosevelt at least, lined up to some degree, at least theoretically, on the part of the small man. But in the Roosevelt administration, this was carried far, far beyond where it had ever been carried before, to the point where the Roosevelt administration made the federal government a very important part of the daily lives of Americans in a way it had never been before. The United States was also experiencing not only an economic revolution and a political revolution in the 20th century, but also a social revolution, which may be more important than either the other in the long run. The social revolution really began in the late 19th century with the advent of the typewriter, as I talked about last time, which began to bring women out of the home into the workforce. But that was just the beginning. World War I also had an enormous impact here. Because of the wartime labor shortage with so many men overseas, women filled non-traditional jobs, and Southern blacks were recruited from the southern farms to come to the northern cities and work in the steel mills and the packing houses, replacing white workers who had gone into the military. And so for the first time since America began, the concentration of blacks in the South began to be lessened, and larger numbers of American blacks moved into the northern cities and became part of the everyday northern economy. This trend was accentuated in World War II, and then there are some other factors that had an impact on the change in social revolution, social relations also. Of these, the biggest was the automobile. Of all the factors that have revolutionized American life in the 20th century, two stand out. The automobile for one, and then later, television. The two inventions which I think have had absolutely astronomical effects on American thinking and American social mores. In the 1920s, when automobiles first became common, popular, people had them aside from the very few rich, imagine what this did to social mores. All of a sudden, people could go places easily and quickly, in privacy. The automobile broke down the isolation of rural townships, made suburbs possible, and in fact made the decay and destruction of the central cities, if not possible, inevitable, because it meant that people with cars could move further away from their jobs. In Europe, you'll find that the central cities are generally very strong and very prosperous, and the suburban areas are the decaying areas, in contrast to the United States. This is because in Europe to this day, the automobile ownership is not universal, and most people in Europe do not have cars, or a great many people do not have cars, and rely on public transportation to get to their jobs. So that the central cities closest to the jobs are at the premium, whereas the suburban areas further from the jobs are less desirable. In the United States, it's the reverse. Go to any city today and look at the expressways that go into the town, the freeways that go through the town. The freeways are, in effect, conduits for people coming from the suburbs into their jobs in the central cities, fenced off from the territory which they go through. It's as if they're channels guarded by high fences, cut in deep cuts or raised on high bridges to keep people from having to encounter the world through which they pass in their way to their jobs. This is true of many American cities. The automobile also had another enormous impact. For the first time, there was a place where young people could go to be alone and involve themselves in hanky-panky without having somebody supervising them or without having to scratch for a room someplace. The automobile today, I think, even today, is the scene of an enormous number of first sexual encounters and of a great deal of heavy petting and whatever. Just this impact alone, if the automobile had done nothing else, the fact that it's become kind of a rolling, rolling seduction parlor in America has had enormous impact. What happened to women? Well, women were sequestered and put on a pedestal and secluded and generally kept from participation in everyday society in the 19th century. This is broken down completely in the 20th. The automobile was just one step on that road, along with the creation of jobs in which women entered the economy. And thirdly, another factor that's had enormous impact, the creation of the birth control pill, which has had an impact that I don't think anybody's even studied to this point. Such an enormous impact. The automobile had other factors as well. And at least until the 70s or early 80s, 1 out of 7 jobs in America was directly or indirectly connected with the automobile industry. It is the characteristic American industry of the 20th century. The production of cars and all the things that go into them, rubber for tires, glass, steel, textiles, plastics, all these things, the importation and refining of oil and gasoline, all of these characteristics are tied into the automobile industry. Add to that the paving industry, the huge amounts of miles and miles of pavement that have been laid down, the absolutely enormous industry in electronics connected with the auto industry. Ever think of how many traffic lights there are in America? How many billboards there are in America all connected to the automobile? The impact of the automobile on the radio business. The automobile listener is the #1 target of radio stations in America. The automobile has had an absolutely incalculable impact on American society. And again, more so here than anywhere else because in America the automobile was more universally available than anywhere else. In Europe, people couldn't afford cars. The wages weren't high enough. In the United States, mass production and mass sales technology and higher wages made it possible for almost everybody to have a car, to the point where today you're an oddball if you don't have one. Where in America do people not own cars? Outside of the Manhattan Island, I can't think of anywhere where it's not considered a freak not to have a car. Everybody learns to drive when they're 16. Everybody drives till they're 97. Then think of another factor. Think of the enormous cost in lives and property of automobile accidents. What would the insurance industry have been without the automobile? The auto insurance business is an enormous business. The medical care involved in automobile accidents is astronomical. The automobile has been incredibly costly and as well as beneficial economically to America, and changed social mores, changed living standards, changed everything. America without the automobile would be a very different country than it is today. I also mentioned television. Radio actually came first, but you would not believe how soon after successful radio transmission television occurred. Television was a practical possibility. In fact, it was actually being used as early as the 30s, but World War II slowed down its development. However, television has had an enormous impact since World War II, to the fact where today I think more Americans have television sets than have bathrooms. Television has become the national soma, the national hypnotic. It's also the most effective means of promoting products ever developed. Sales are absolutely multiplied by national television. The fact where it pays a corporation to spend $100,000 a minute to advertise their products on TV. It pays time and time over. And we haven't seen the limit yet to the effectiveness of TV as a sales tool. It's perhaps also been very effective in a negative way in the sense that the average American watches so much of it, particularly so much violent TV, one wonders if the crime rate may not be related to that too. We'll talk about crime a little bit later. But anyway, automobiles, television, these are some of the factors that have shaped our 20th century world. The outstanding facts about the 20th century, as I said before, is the emergence of the United States as a world power and domestic reform at home. I mentioned the Roosevelt Administration and some of the things it did. I haven't gone further. The Supreme Court was the large barrier to the Roosevelt program because the justices were not willing to accept many of those laws. They considered that unconstitutional as being not provided for by the Constitution and expansion of federal powers and activity. And the Supreme Court vetoed a number of Roosevelt's plans. Roosevelt threatened to enlarge the court, and Congress does have the power to do that. And as a result of that threat and the appointment of a couple of new justices, he managed to turn the Supreme Court's attitude around, beginning about 1937. And from 1937 to basically now, the Supreme Court has been a leader in social reform rather than a foot-dragger. The Supreme Court led the reform of the education system, led the civil rights revolution with its Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, probably the most important single decision ever issued by the American Supreme Court, certainly the most important in the 20th century. The Supreme Court has taken the cutting edge and been the leader in social reform rather than the follower. Not only in civil rights reform, but also in criminal rights reform. The Supreme Court has had an enormous effect since the Miranda decision and many others. Today, the Supreme Court seems to be pulling back its back somewhat as a result of the appointment of a number of more conservative justices. And yet, the things that the court did in 1954 and on are now so firmly a part of American life that if the court tries to go back on those things, the court will be ignored, because you can't turn the clock back. If the court were to issue a decision today, inconceivable as it may seem, and inconceivable as it is, that racial segregation in public facilities is acceptable, the court would simply not be accepted. The court would not be able to enforce that decision. Government would never enforce it. The Supreme Court has no enforcement power of its own, you know. So, talking about the Supreme Court, I guess, is important at this point. What Roosevelt's administration did was to force the court to turn around its attitude by the very fact that the Roosevelt policies were so popular with the country. There's an old line by Finley Peter Dunn, Mr. Dooley, who said, "The Supreme Court follows the election returns." And to a great extent, that's true. The Supreme Court can't get too out of step with the public feeling because it doesn't have any power of enforcement. The only enforcement power it has is moral. The fact that it is the Supreme Court and people look up to it and think it's important what the Supreme Court decides. But if the Supreme Court were to make a decision so ridiculously out of step that the public would not accept it, the court's influence would wane. And that's exactly what happened in the Dred Scott case in 1858, 1857, when the Supreme Court went against the popular feeling in the North and ruled that a black man could never be a citizen of the United States. That decision was simply not accepted by the public, and the court went into eclipse for a long time. Being a Supreme Court justice is like riding a wave and surfing. You have to tell where the public trend is leading and how far you can go in supporting or leading that trend without getting too out of step with the country as a whole. Fascinating job being a Supreme Court justice. Most people think of being a justice as simply interpreting the law. Well, of course it's interpreting the law. But in order to interpret the law, you can't ignore the condition of the society in which the law is being put forth. That's one reason why I do not think the Supreme Court today is likely to overrule Roe versus Wade, because I think it would put the Supreme Court so out of step with the vast majority of Americans that the decision would simply not be accepted. But that's a personal opinion anyway. Again, the impact of European events on America is so classically illustrated in the late 30s rather, in the early 40s. While America was concerned so much with the Depression at home, another answer to depression and to economic distress arose in Europe: fascism, invented by Mussolini in Italy and taken over and much more virulent form by Hitler in Germany beginning in 1933. The Versailles Treaty had forbidden Germany to rearm. Hitler rearmed. The Versailles Treaty had prohibited German military occupation of other countries. Hitler occupied the Rhineland first. And then in 1939, he attacked Poland. In 1940, he attacked Norway. He attacked France. He attacked virtually all of his neighbors. In 1938, he incorporated Austria into Germany. And the march of fascism continued to the point where the British Prime Minister, who thought he had bought time at Munich, who thought he had bought peace in our time, found that all he had bought was another disaster, another defeat. And so war clouds were ominous on the European horizon as early as 1938. Certainly in 1939, when the war began in Poland, the war began for Britain and France in 1939. France was defeated by 1940, and Britain stood alone. This time, the United States, again, was faced with the crisis of should we remain neutral or should we support Britain? As in 1914. But this time, the perceived threat to America was so much greater that while the neutrality sentiment was strong, by 1940, it was quickly changing. America adopted military conscription in peacetime for the first time in 1940. And vast orders for defense equipment began to go out. It wasn't soon enough to deter the Japanese from attacking Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Japan did so partly because the Japanese didn't think America would fight. They didn't think America could fight. They didn't think America would want to fight. After the war, the Japanese were asked why they took that terrible gamble. And one of the things that came out was the Japanese saw Americans drilling with wooden guns and realized that America did not have a very high military preparedness in 1941, and they felt that they could win the war before America would want to fight or would be able to fight. There was also another gamble involved in this. It's long been said that Roosevelt maneuvered Japan to attack Pearl Harbor to get the United States into the war. Well, that wasn't really necessary, even if he had wanted to, because Germany had already sunk American ships in the summer of 41. The same thing that brought the United States into the war following the Lusitania with the aid of the Zimmermann telegram. The same thing could have been used against Germany in 1941. The Pearl Harbor attack, in other words, was not necessary from that point anyway. And, of course, Roosevelt didn't maneuver the Japanese into attacking Pearl Harbor, but what did happen was the Americans cut off shipments of scrap iron and oil to Japan in 1941 because Japan had been at war with China since 1937. And these sanctions were used to try to force Japan to give up its presence in China. The idea was that Americans had always had a strong China lobby, Chinese people in America, American Chinese interests abroad, who have attempted to support Chinese interest in America. And the American Congress, following the lead of the China market, and because Japan was a unpleasant fascist power in sympathetic league with Germany, cut off shipments of supplies of oil and gasoline to Japan, oil and steel to Japan in 1940. Well, the Japanese have no oil of their own. One of the facts of the Japanese economy ever since Japan began to become a Western country in the 19th century has been Japan has no resources of its own. No oil, no coal, no iron ore, no nothing. Japan is entirely dependent on importing goods, manufacturing, and reselling goods. From the military point of view, also, Japan is an entirely dependent country. Japan had a very powerful navy, but no oil supplies to run it on. And when American shipments were cut off, the Japanese government figured that it had 6 months of oil to run its navy on, and that was it. At the end of those 6 months, the Japanese navy would become immobile for lack of oil supplies. Japan, in other words, had to conquer some oil supply within 6 months or give up its attempt to become a world power, give up its military forces altogether. Japan was not willing to give up its attempt to become an Asian power and a world power. It certainly was not willing to give up its military options. And so Japan formed a plan for conquering the oil fields in the East Indies. Those oil fields were largely owned by Britain and France and the Dutch. Japan knew very well that an attack on Britain in 1941 would probably bring an American response, and if the American fleet were in existence, the Japanese would have a much tougher fight. So the Japanese figured, since they are going to get the United States into the war anyway, we might as well go whole hog the American fleet while we can. This was the origin of the Pearl Harbor attack of December 1941. But what's forgotten is that at the same time the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, they also occupied the oil fields and British possessions and French possessions and Dutch possessions in the Near East. And in fact, in the Far East, rather. And in fact, American intelligence knew all about the Japanese plans to attack at various places. The question was, where were they going to attack? Pearl Harbor was only one of the many possibilities and not one of the most important. The conclusion of the intelligence agencies was largely that the Japanese would probably attack the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies first, because that's where the oil was. And in fact, the Japanese did attack those places in 1941, but they also added the Pearl Harbor raid to attempt to knock out the American fleet. The Japanese thinking was if they could knock out the American Navy, they could consolidate their control of the oil fields and of the Far East so completely that the United States couldn't fight and wouldn't bother, and that the United States would simply accept the Japanese Far East. Well, of course, they figured wrong, but that was the thinking behind the Pearl Harbor attack. It is also significant that the United States did not declare war on Germany following the Pearl Harbor attack in December 1941. It was Hitler who declared war on the United States on December 8th or December 9th, 1941. So for those people who have always argued that Roosevelt maneuvered Japan to attack Pearl Harbor so he could enter the war against Germany, just tain't so, McGee. It was the other way around. It was Germany who attacked the United States who declared war. And by that time, of course, American support of Britain had been so clear that Hitler wasn't losing anything by attacking. He knew he'd have to fight the United States sooner or later, and he declared war in December of 41. So the United States got into World War II, the greatest of all wars. The war to end all wars was supposed to be World War I, and it ended nothing. It had to be fought all over again 25 years later. It's hard for us to imagine today, only 50 years later, the degree to which World War II strained the American economy at the time. Never before had so many Americans gone into uniform. I think at one point we had 4 million people under arms in World War II. In a population approximately about 140 million, well under 100 million people less than we have today just 50 years later. The strain on the economy was acute. It meant rationing for many products. Rubber was rationed, not so much, or rather, oil was rationed, not so much because oil was in short supply, but because rubber was in short supply. The reason gasoline was rationed was to keep people from driving and wearing out their tires, because the rubber was needed for the military effort. But World War II, again, like the Civil War and like World War I, was a bonanza for American industry. It attracted huge orders, enormous numbers of factories were built, employment increased, investment increased. The defense expenditures gave the federal government another reason to pour money into the economy and to borrow money to do it. Like the Civil War, less like World War I, but like the Civil War, the war effort was financed largely by borrowing. The borrowing was done both from American citizens and abroad. A lot of it was done by war bonds, which were sold to American citizens. Those are simply notes, bonds that are payable in the future. And as in the Civil War, World War II provided not a decline in American industry, but a tremendous advance in the American economy. Sure, demand was pent up for 4 years because of the war effort, but after the war, the amount of consumer spending was astronomical, and the economy grew at a tremendous rate. Again, the same lesson we saw in the Civil War, the same lesson we've seen before, that massive spending in the economy produces massive results in terms of the economy. The economy grows a lot faster. That is why, and I keep saying this over and over again, people should not be overly concerned with budget deficits as long as the budget deficit can be financed, because in the long run, you get paid back far, far more than you put in. If the budget deficits were so bad, we've run one continuously since about 1932, the country should have gone to hell in a handbasket by now. On the contrary, the economy is far, far bigger than it ever was. Secondly, the deficits that the United States government ran in World War II were much bigger than the deficits that it runs today. Something like 25% of the GNP, whereas today it's maybe 4 to 5% of the gross national product. So that the lesson of history when it comes to deficits is it isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world to have a deficit. In fact, it may be the best thing in the world, depending on how big the deficit is and how it's financed. World War II resulted in the absolute total destruction of the German economy and the Japanese economy, and the near destruction of the British and French economies, also the Russian economy. At the end of World War II, there was one great economic power left in the world. The United States completely dominated the economics of the world in a way that it never could before and never will again, unless we should have another unforeseen destruction of the world's economies. For those people who think that the normal state of affairs should be that America dominates the world's economy everywhere, remember that that is not the normal state of affairs. It was an aberration produced by World War II. The reconstruction after the war was promoted by the United States, the reconstruction of Europe and Japan, by the Marshall Plan in Europe and by direct investment in Japan, because it was obvious that a decimated world was a weak world and that economically nobody would be better off. The lesson of World War I was that a war-decimated economy pulls everybody else down with it. If people can't buy things, if they don't have any income, they can't buy foreign products either, and your economy suffers in the long run. In other words, the lesson of World War I was that we were in a world economy. And if we were in a world economy in World War I, we certainly were in World War II and today. I come again and again to these questions of involvement of American history with European history and Asian history, the fact that no country stands alone in history, with the questions of how events in one part of the world impact on events in other parts of the world, how the interrelationships are always present, and today even more so than ever. These are questions that history can enlighten us about. And if we ignore our history, both domestic and foreign, we are to not to complain when things go wrong for us, because the lessons are there to be learned. Since World War II, the question becomes, where does history stop and where does current events begin? It's generally considered that at least 20 years must go by before you can really write history. You have to have a perspective of some time. We're just now writing the perspective of the Korean War, which came about after World War II, part of the Great Cold War between the United States and the USSR, which followed World War II. I just as soon not get into this because it's too current. Only in this last 5 years, in fact in the last 2 years, have we seen a reversal of the Cold War thinking to the point where the Soviet Union today is lining up with the United States in Iraq. I don't think we really ought to get into this because I'm not sure that it's really history at this point yet. It's too new. There's no perspective on it yet. So I think I'm going to conclude my thinking about American history with the World War II and the immediate post-war period after World War II. The conclusions to be reached are that in the 20th century, the United States came of age as a world power, as a world economic power and military power, that domestic reform made a better life for more people in the United States than any other country in the history of the world has ever enjoyed for more of its citizens. And if that was true in 1945 and 1950, it is even more true in 1990. No country in the world has ever provided for more of its citizens a standard of living equal to what the United States provides today, even for American poor people today. For those who are poor in America, that's like being a millionaire in many countries of the world. Secondly, no country has ever provided so much liberty, so many options, so much choice to its citizens as the United States provides today. Talk to people who come to America from other societies, even from a society so free as Britain, and they will tell you that the difference is enormous. That the feeling of freedom in America, the feeling of possibilities, is almost beyond comprehension to someone who grows up in a more constricted society. Part of the cost we pay for this may be a cost in crime. But in the long run, the question becomes, where else in the world would you rather live? And for most people in the world, not only in the United States, but for most people in the world, their golden dream is to come to America. We're lucky enough to be here already.